A brief word about some upcoming events here at the Kennan Institute. Next Monday, April 25th, we'll have a noon discussion here with Olga Kazmina, a professor of religion at Moscow State University, and she will be talking about the Russian Orthodox Church in the post-Soviet period challenges and responses. On Tuesday, April 26th, in the fifth floor conference room, we will have a seminar from 3:30 to 5:30 with Lisa Paul, discussing her book, Swimming in the Daylight, An American Student, a Soviet Jewish Dissident, and the Gift of Hope. The following week, the first week of May, we're very busy with 3 events. On Monday, we'll have a noon discussion by Terrell Starr, Life as a Black Ukrainian, How Some Natives Are Treated Like Foreigners. And then on Tuesday and Wednesday, we have major events. On Tuesday, May 3rd, we have a conference co-sponsored by the Henry M. Jackson Foundation on Russia and the European Court of Human Rights from 10 till 5:30. And on Wednesday, May 4th, we'll have a performance of the play 1 hour and 18 dealing with the Magnitsky case. So some very busy weeks coming here at the Kennan Institute. Well, we're so pleased that all of you could come this afternoon. Today's event, we're very pleased, is co-sponsored by the Social Science Research Council, Eurasia Program. We're all gathered here, a bunch of us, as part of the SSRC's Dissertation Support Fellowship Workshop. And we've just had a very good kickoff, and we'll be very busy for the next couple days going through some variety of papers. I'm very grateful to Cindy Buckley from SSRC and her staff for helping to arrange this. They've just been great partners to work with. And just so that you all know, after today's presentation, the Kennan Institute and the SSRC will co-sponsor a reception outside just in the foyer. So we look forward to all of you being able to attend. Well, we're very happy to have Charles King here. To begin with, he is in fact a former participant of the SSRC Dissertation Workshop program. And so it kind of shows where it all can end up. We're just very pleased that he's able to come here. Charles is a professor of international affairs and government at Georgetown University. He is the author of numerous books, including The Ghost of Freedom, A History of the Caucasus, and The Black Sea, A History. His articles and commentary has appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers. He is a graduate of the University of Arkansas, and he later earned his master's and doctoral degrees at Oxford University, where he was a British Marshall Scholar. Today, Charles is going to talk about his new book, Odessa, Genius and Death in a City of Dreams. So, great. Charles? And the book is just outside on sale, so we encourage you all to purchase it on the way out.
Thanks very much, Will. And I'm told it makes a fantastic Mother's Day gift as well. Thanks very much for hosting me, and not only to Kennan, but also to the SSRC. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the dissertation workshop. The folks who are writing dissertations these days, the work is absolutely fantastic, sophisticated, interesting, and beautifully put together. If I speak like that, is that better for the folks in the podcast area? Okay. So I'm delighted to be a part of that, and thank you, Cindy Buckley and others who invited me. I wanted to talk today about this new book called Odessa, Genius and Death in a City of Dreams. It is a book about how one of Europe's great Jewish cities stopped being one of Europe's great Jewish cities. But it's not just about the end of a city and I think its most vibrant community. The city is still there. Of course, it's well worth visiting. There are still Jews in the city, although far fewer than before 1941. The book is also, though, about the power of place and about the resilience of place and about how particular pieces of real estate that develop reputations for whatever reason, because of their cultural vibrancy, because of their uniqueness, because of their history, have a kind of immortality to them. And regardless of what happens on a particular piece of real estate, they manage somehow to reproduce themselves in other pieces of real estate around the world. So the book actually ends up in Brighton Beach, or Little Odessa, as it's sometimes called, in Brooklyn. with some reflections about the immortality of place and what happens when nostalgia is the thing that comes to substitute for experience, how nostalgia has a kind of immortality to it as well. What I thought I would do today in the next half hour or so is to tell you a little bit, first of all, about how I came to write this book. I've been to Odessa many times over the last 20 years, and I feel like, in a way, the book was kind of 20 years in the making, even though when I first visited the city in 1992, I think, I didn't think that I would eventually write a book about it. I then want to come on to some of the stories and themes that animate the book itself, and finally to spend most of my time talking about what I think is the city's core mystery. There are plenty of cities, especially great Jewish cities in East Central Europe, Łódź, for example, that transformed themselves over the course of the 1940s, or were transformed forcibly over the course of the 1940s. But in Odessa's case, I think there's a core mystery here that it does share with some other Central and East European states. The mystery is this: how a great cosmopolitan center learned to devour itself in a relatively short period. Part of the story of Odessa that you hear if you look at the Soviet historiography, or of course look at the way in which many Odessans talk about their own history now, there's a great blank spot in the city's history from September, October of 1941 to April of 1944. You'll see a few sentences about it in history books, but not much more than that. To me, that's the core of the city's 20th century history, and by the core of it, I mean the point at which the city underwent the greatest change, not only demographically. When, to give you the upshot of the story, the city's Jewish population goes from around 200,000 people in the fall of 1941, a third of the city's total at that stage, to 48 in the summer of 1944. Not 48,000, but 48 people, which is a shocking testament to the destruction of this of this city during the war. And so I want to spend most of the talk really talking about that core mystery. How did this cosmopolitan place experience, in some ways, the antithesis of cosmopolitanism over the course of 907 days during the Second World War? So first of all, how I came to write this book. When I sat down to think through writing a history of this city, my wife said to me that you should really let this story kind of get to you. It's one thing to write an academic treatment of a city or a country or a sea or what have you, but it's another thing to sort of get into the story and let the story get into you. And I took that to heart in a way, and the story actually got to me in a particular place. It's this place in Odessa, which I didn't realize it at the time, but actually ended up being, in many ways, the inspiration for this book. It's a building that is located on the corner of Zhukovsky Street and Pushkin Street in the old city center of Odessa. Rather nondescript, a mid-late 19th century neo-Gothic building, crumbling in many ways, a gigantic crack that runs all the way from the foundation to the roof line. If you happen to go inside, you'll find it's been cut up into a rabbit warren of different rooms. It is today the state archive of the Odessa region. So that if you're working on the city's history, social history, political history, economic history, history of the grain trade, of banking, of anything else that might interest you in the city's past, you would go here to find the relevant documents to write your history. And it's a magnificently open place, the staff incredibly helpful, and the archives are at the disposal not only of local scholars but of foreign scholars as well. Before it was the State Archive of the Odessa region, it was called the Rosa Luxemburg Workers Club, where you could go to do your calisthenics, helping to create the new Soviet man and woman in what is today the reading hall of the building. But before it was the Rosa Luxemburg Workers Club, it was this. It was called the Brody or the Brodsky Synagogue. in Odessa. It was the most important, next to the Glavnaya, or the main synagogue in Odessa, the most important synagogue in the city. It was the main choral synagogue in Odessa for most of the 19th century. The chief cantor, a man by the name of Nisan Blumenthal, was literally, in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, world famous, and many of his melodies and harmonies are sung around the world today. The way in which the story got to me was that the dark, horrific, in so many ways, irony that if you want to understand what happened to Odessa's Jewish community in the middle of the 20th century, the place you go is to this old synagogue to find out. If you want to know something about the period of occupation during the Second World War and the way in which this core mystery, as I indicated earlier, played itself out, the way in which the city learned to devour itself, the place you go is to the old Brody Synagogue. So in so many ways, I think the city has a tragic history over the course of the 20th century, a story of the way in which multiculturalism fails, in which the cosmopolitan ideals of the city fail, and then in which, after 1945, nostalgia in many ways triumphs over history and memory. Nostalgia, I believe today, in some ways, gets in the way of our understanding the real history of the city over the 20th century. But what I wanted to try to investigate in the old Brody Synagogue was how this happened in some more detail, and try to tell the city's 20th century history in ways that it hadn't been told before. One of the places you have to start, though, if you're interested in the modern history of Odessa, really is with these two figures shown together. And I like this photograph from 1934 when the two of them were working on the great unfinished film Bejin Meadow, because they are, I think, more responsible than anyone else for creating the two modern images of Odessa that many of us have. On the left, of course, the great Russian Jewish writer Isaac Babel, the creator of the Odessa Tales and Red Cavalry. But in the Odessa Tales, or the Odessa Stories in particular, he gives a vision of the city that has come down to us as quintessentially Odessan. He was writing about the neighborhood that he knew best, the neighborhood just to the northwest of the city center called Moldavanka, that had traditionally been a lower middle class and poor, primarily Jewish neighborhood, filled with gangsters and men on the make and ne'er-do-wells, prostitutes, bent cops, the kind of people who populate the Odessa stories. And it's that kind of Odessa, the Odessa of the person who can figure out the way to manipulate the system to his or her advantage, the person who's always on the edge, literally geographically on the edge of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and in Moldavanka's case, on the edge of the old city of Odessa itself, someone who can figure out a way through the mess and mass of a state administration, a good-natured crook, or a ganef in Yiddish. By the time Babel had sat down to write these stories, though, that world was already disappearing. So Babel himself is, in fact, engaging in this kind of act of nostalgia about the city that he perhaps knew in his childhood, but by his young adulthood and full adulthood had already begun to pass more into myth and memory than into the reality of the present that he happened to inhabit. In fact, in one of the later stories, Freund Grotch, he has this magnificent scene in which one of the old lions of underground, of criminal Odessa, is killed by the Cheka, by the Bolshevik secret police. And one of his last words is, "They've killed off all the old lions. They're killing off all the old lions." That is to say, that Odessa, the late imperial Odessa, was already ending, of course, by Babel's day, had already ended. The other person who is in the photo on the right is a person who wasn't Odessan by birth, spent relatively little time in the city, but is probably responsible for the most important visual representation of the city. If Babel is our literary Odessan par excellence, the person who gave us the visual images of the city is Sergei Eisenstein, the Soviet filmmaker, famous for many films, October among them, but in Odessa's case, most famous for his film from 1925, Battleship Potemkin, or Battleship Potemkin. Battleship Potemkin was the story, you'll recall, of an event that happened 20 years before the film was actually released. Eisenstein was commissioned by the Central Committee of the Communist Party to create a film about the 1905 revolution. And Eisenstein, displaying the sort of brilliance for which he was known, decided not to set the film in Petersburg, but to set it on the edge of the empire, to put it in Odessa, the empire's greatest port, the city that in so many ways linked the late empire to the rest of the world through the grain trade, through migration, indeed throughout most of the 19th century through disease as well, one of the things that knitted together Odessa and Constantinople. And he chose to put at the center of that film the revolt in the city that centered around the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin itself, a ship that in 1905 set sail for military exercises on the Black Sea from a port in Crimea. While at sea, in response to the officers trying to make the men and ratings eat rancid meat, there was a revolt on board, a mutiny on board. The seamen revolted. They took many of the officers captive after the officers had tried to execute some of the leaders of that revolt. And then this mutinous battleship, raising the red flag of revolution, sails to Odessa, lobs a few shells ashore. When the seamen try to bring one of their comrades who's been killed in the melee ashore and try to have a kind of informal a wake for him, burial procession on shore. That's the thing that sparks the brief revolution in Odessa in 1905. The seamen, the workers, the peasants of the city band together, rise up against Tsarist oppressors until, of course, they are defeated by soldiers of the Tsar's army marching down the steps of Odessa in the most famous scene from the film. You'll recall it if you've seen the film, this white wave of white-tunicked soldiers at the top of the steps marching, jackboot after jackboot down the steps, firing on the crowd, pushing them actually into a phalanx of Cossacks at the bottom of the steps. And there's that magnificent baby carriage at the top of the steps. Why someone is out walking a baby in the middle of this, we don't know. But the baby carriage that's at the top of the steps gets pushed, and the carriage bounces down that great granite cataract of steps in Odessa. And we, of course, don't know really what happens to the baby, but we expect it wasn't a good end. It's the most copied scene in film history, probably. Terry Gilliam, Brian De Palma, Woody Allen have all copied it in their films in various ways. It's probably the most famous single scene of any film ever created. The interesting thing to me about Eisenstein, about Battleship Potemkin in particular, is how much of it was, of course, Eisenstein's own creation. There was no baby carriage. There was no real battle on the steps of Odessa, for that matter. There was a great deal of shooting in the city in the summer and fall of 1905. There was a battleship Potemkin. There was a mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, but it sailed into Odessa harbor, did offload one of the comrades who had been killed while at sea, lobbed a few shells ashore, and then set sail out of Odessa harbor to the Romanian port at Constanța, where it surrendered. And that was essentially the end of the story. The mutinous seamen on board ship either stayed in Romania or went back to the Russian Empire or eventually emigrated abroad. Until the 1980s, I'm told, there was a fish and chips shop in Dublin where you could go and have one Ivan Beshoff regale you with stories about what it was like to have been a sailor on board the battleship Potemkin. He became a fish and chips shop owner. in Dublin. Decorating the shop, again, I'm told, with paraphernalia from the period and images from Eisenstein's film, using that as the kind of representation of reality. And of course, if you're aficionados of the History Channel, although you're far too sophisticated to watch the History Channel, but if you've watched the History Channel, you know that anytime they're not treating Hitler and Stalin, which is the main topic of the History Channel, but when they're treating the Russian Revolution, of course, they're using often many scenes from Eisenstein's film, October in particular, to illustrate the Bolshevik Revolution, as if there were documentary cameras there filming the events. Of course, 1905 Eisenstein's 1925 film had exactly the same role in the 1920s and 1930s in the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the 1905 revolution. It was taken as a kind of documentary. And in fact, when the film was eventually shown in Odessa, it actually premiered abroad in Paris and in New York and elsewhere long before it ever came to Odessa. Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and others were great fans of the film before it had been seen by anyone in the city about which the story had been framed. When it was eventually shown there, many people who sort of came forward claiming to have been featured in the film until they were told that, in fact, particular scenes were totally made up. You couldn't have been featured in the film because no such scene actually existed. There was, in fact, a legal case about the film where someone tried to sue Eisenstein because they had taken his story, until Eisenstein had a brilliant legal defense, which is that I couldn't have stolen your story because I made up your story. But what Eisenstein provides via Odessa and via Battleship Potemkin is a kind of prehistory for the Bolshevik Revolution. This is the origin of workers' discontent. This is the origin of revolution that fails in 1905 only to succeed brilliantly a dozen years later. He becomes the prehistoric prophet, if you like, for the Bolsheviks themselves, creating a usable history for the regime that he now served by 1925. Now, both of these characters, Babel and Eisenstein, I think, are absolutely central to modern images of Odessa. And of course, they're images that aren't false by any means. Babel was writing, in some ways, as a fictional memoirist about a neighborhood and a city that he knew intimately as a native. Eisenstein was writing about an event that actually did take place, that is, the uprising of 1905 in the city, the mutiny on board the battleship, even though, of course, in Eisenstein's case, he leaves out what at the time I think you would have noted as the key event of 1905, which was the largest anti-Jewish pogrom up to that point in Russian history, which you never find in Battleship Potemkin. There is one reference to Jews in the film, which you may recall as the body of the slain comrade is brought ashore. There are a group of bourgeois grain traders kind of standing around the workers and peasants who have gathered on the Odessa docks. And you hear someone, or you see, because it's a silent film, you see someone cry out, "Bei Zhidov," the cry, "kill the Jews," the cry of pogrom makers sort of throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. But the workers and peasants, of course, reject the call to turn this into an anti-Jewish pogrom and, in fact, keep on the course of workers and peasants' solidarity and revolution. But that's the only reference to what I think anyone who lived through those events would have noted as the primary lines of violence in the city in 1905. When Eisenstein sat down to record his memoirs, which I'm not in the habit of not recommending books, but I would not recommend to you Eisenstein's memoirs. They are very, very difficult and incredibly frustrating to read, and not terribly informative either. They're written in a kind of stream of consciousness style. It's sort of one very long prose poem. But there's one moment when he reflects in 1946 on his experience with Battleship Potemkin in 1925. And he says, I wonder what happened to that baby. Eisenstein was probably the only director in film history who never knew the identity of his lead. He never knew who the baby was in the carriage. There's one shot in the film where you see the baby kind of looking up at the camera. I never knew who it was. And he says in a very poignant way in his memoirs, I wonder who that was. Where is he or she now? He didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. Is he lying or she lying in a mass grave somewhere, he writes. Did he or she defend the fatherland? Where is he or she now? And he goes through a whole set of life possibilities for this kid, who would have been less than a year old in 1925. So, on the edge of adulthood. In fact, perhaps fully an adult by 1946, if that person were still alive. And it's a poignant moment because you realize that in the life of that particular child, you've witnessed the entirety of early Stalinism. You witnessed the entirety of the Second World War experience. You witnessed the entirety of the Great Purges and collectivization. And even Eisenstein himself understands the monumentality of those 21 or so years in the life of this child, had that person actually survived. Eisenstein did not spend the Second World War years in Odessa. He had very little connection to the city, even though he and Babel had remained friends and artistic colleagues and collaborators throughout the late 1920s and throughout much of the 1930s. But he was right to focus on that child's life and that child's experiences as emblematic of the city's history, because by 1946, the city had undergone incredible changes over the course of the Second World War. It was one of the first 4 Soviet cities, along with Leningrad, Sevastopol, and Stalingrad, to be given the title of Gorod Geroi, of Hero City. It was within that list, though, in some ways, the odd city out, because, of course, Leningrad, 2.5 years of siege, Stalingrad, the anvil on which the effort in the war effort in the East had been broken. Sevastopol, a city that underwent an 8-month siege, incredible bombardment of the center of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet by German aircraft, and then Odessa, a city that had experienced a brief siege in the fall of 1941, a brief counter-siege in the spring of 1944 when the Red Army begins its westward push. But for the rest of the war period, 907 days had been under military and civilian occupation. The largest and most significant Soviet city to be occupied during the war by a country other than Nazi Germany. It's in fact the only Soviet city of any size that is under non-German occupation throughout the war. And in fact, there are a number of twists in this city's history during those 907 days, from October 16th, 1941 to April 10th, 1944. The only time Odessa has a ghetto in its entire Jewish ghetto, in its entire history, is during that period. There had never been in the city's history a Jewish neighborhood. Jews lived in Odessa wherever they could afford to live. And in fact, in the history of Russian Jewry, of Central European Jewry, Odessa stands out as a kind of place where it was possible to begin your life again, to transform your life as a Jew, to be successful in ways that you couldn't be in in other relatively restricted environments within the old pale of settlement. Jews lived throughout the city. Not so in the fall of 1941 and the spring of 1942. It's a city that, despite its hero status, witnesses the near total elimination of its Jewish population. From the figure I gave you earlier, from 200,000 people in 1941 to 48 people in 1944. The good news there is about 2/3 somewhere between a half and two-thirds of the Jewish population of the city actually manages to evacuate before October of 1941. Evacuated by boat, by land, by the Soviet authorities, and many of Odessa's Odessans Jews spend the war years, like other Odessans, in the North Caucasus and Central Asia, and elsewhere, in some ways recreating the life they might have known before in Soviet Odessa before the war. But one thing in the middle of this book I really wanted to do was to try to give an account of what happened in the city during the war itself, because no one has done that before, even though the archival data that you need to do it are there, and they're rich, and they're pretty magnificent. The Soviets, when they came back through Odessa in 1944, capture over 40,000 files of the civilian and military administration in the city during the war, and all of those are open and available to researchers in the Odessa archives. The folks who are at the center of this story, as occupiers, as I mentioned, were not Germans, but Odessa's neighbors, the Romanians. Romania was in charge of the city throughout the war. It became the capital of a district that the Romanians called Transnistria, a stretch of territory that we may know today as a little secessionist republic on the eastern edge of Moldova, but in the 1940s was a much larger territory between the Dniester River and the southern Bug River inside what is today extreme western Ukraine. When the Romanians come into the city, they find somewhere between 70 and 80,000 Jews left. That's according to the Romanian mayor at the time. And what proceeds to happen over the next 4 or 5 months is the progressive ghettoization of Jews in the city, a series of massacres in the city that I'll talk about in a moment, and then finally the deportation of the city's Jews to other areas controlled by Romania inside this Transnistria zone. The person who is at the center of that story as the governor of Transnistria, a person really not known to most folks beyond Romanian specialists, is the person you see here just at the bottom of the large mural. He's standing behind his desk. His name is Gheorghe Alexianu, Professor Gheorghe Alexianu, actually. And I think I'm right in saying, although I would welcome correction on this, that he's the only professor to have been executed at the end of the war for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He had been a law professor in Romania before the war and was named by the Romanians to be governor of Transnistria during the war itself. And even though you can't see it, I will confirm that, yes, that is a Hitler mustache that he's wearing. He wore one throughout the war. He's incidentally standing in this photograph from a contemporary newspaper. He's standing in the old ballroom of the Vorontsov Palace in Odessa, the palace of the old governors, originally built in the 1830s by Count Vorontsov for his wife, Lise Vorontsova. She became famous not only as one of the most important and grandest hostesses in Odessa, but also as one of the mistresses, lovers, and inspirations for Alexander Pushkin, particularly for the Tatyana Larina character in Yevgeny Onegin. So we can't say that Lise Vorontsova and Pushkin met in this ballroom in the 1820s, because the building itself didn't arise until the 1830s, when Pushkin was long gone from Odessa. But it is a dark and horrific irony, perhaps, that the office of the governor of Transnistria was set up in the old Vorontsov Palace, replacing a previous mural that had been there of a kind of avuncular Stalin with children, because this had been the Young Pioneers headquarters in the 1920s and 1930s. The Romanians take it over and slap on a mural of Ion Antonescu, the military dictator of Romania, throughout the war. And then just there on the right-hand side of the photo, you can see an operational map of Transnistria at large. This is also another photo of Alexianu. He's on the extreme right here, giving a salute. This is, once again, not not a Nazi salute, it's the Roman salute that the Romanians themselves pioneer already in the 1930s. Don't pioneer it, but they don't adopt it from the Nazis. It's their own salute. So what's happening in Transnistria during this period? Well, the change in Odessa itself comes on a very specific date. The Romanians come into the city with the idea that they're going to at least round up, perhaps also deport the Jewish population in the city. In fact, their initial plans, as were the plans of Hungarians to the north, and in fact Germans in the summer and early fall of 1941, is to push Jews and other undesirables as far east as possible. But as we know from the work of Holocaust scholars today, summarized and expanded by Tim Snyder in his magnificent book Bloodlands, is that from the summer to the early winter of 1941-1942, the idea of actually being able to kill Jews in place dawns on the Nazis and their allies. There are a series of massacres then that take place in Transnistria in the fall and early winter of 1941. The date that's important here is October 22nd, 1941, because on that date, the Romanian military headquarters in Odessa is bombed. The NKVD in their the Stalinist secret police, as they exit the city, plant a series of bombs and mines in their old headquarters, which then becomes the headquarters of the Romanian occupation government during the war. Those bombs explode on October 22nd. And Antonescu, the person you saw pictured in the mural in the previous slide, orders the massacre of Jews, communists, Bolsheviks in the city. In fact, all of those terms are to the Romanian occupation authorities more or less interchangeable. To be Jewish, to be a communist is more or less the same thing, and somewhere around 20 to 25,000 people are executed by the Romanians in the weeks following October 22nd. If that story is at all familiar, that story should be rather familiar to you in a way, because exactly the same thing happened a week earlier in Kiev, where the German military headquarters was bombed, and it was in fact that event that was the precursor to a series of massacres that end in Baba Yar in central Kiev, the largest single massacre, somewhere around 30 or 33,000 people killed over the course of just a few days in central Kiev. Alexianu is the character who is at the center of this effort, and I try to sort of explain in a way where he comes from and where these policies of the Romanians come from during the war. To a degree, they're aping the Germans, but more than anything, I think the Romanians are developing their own kind of micro-empire on the fly. They never annex Transnistria, unlike Hungarians, for example, in 1938 and 39 in Transcarpathia, where that region that would later become Soviet is absorbed into the greater Hungarian state. The Romanians continue to see Transnistria as occupied territory, a place where they will dispose of, if you like, Jews, Roma, political criminals, and others who can be deported to the east. Regardless of these atrocities, or perhaps in spite of these atrocities that lead to the deaths of somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 Jews over the course of the war, Romania is second only to Nazi Germany in the number of Jews who died during the war under its watch. A fact that I think has still not that really has not, I think, come into the consciousness of people except perhaps Holocaust era historians. Despite this, rates of survival in Romanian-occupied Transnistria are still probably an order of magnitude higher than in German-occupied Ukraine. The Romanians have a kind of callous disregard for Jews that they deport, ghettoize, and put into a series of camps or neighborhoods patrolled by Romanians or by local ethnic German militia or by Ukrainian police. But there are no death facilities in Transnistria. It is in some ways a kind of cruel disregard for the fate of the interned through disease or the actions of locals than it is a kind of active effort to eliminate them on the model, say, of Nazi Germany's death facilities. And I try to sort of tell this more complex story, not through Alexianu himself, but through another character, German Puntea, who was the mayor of Odessa, the Romanian mayor of Odessa, throughout the war. Alexianu, as I mentioned, was executed by the Romanian authorities in Romanian communist authorities in 1946. I have watched the video, the film of his execution, which was made at the time. It's pretty horrific viewing. But he's the only one of the four who were executed, including Ion Antonescu, the military dictator. He's the only one who stands ramrod straight throughout his execution. He was, in some ways, on the Romanian side, the truest of the true believers, a Romanian version of a Himmler or a Goebbels. This other character, German Puntea, was very different. He had been mayor before the war of Chisinau, the capital, today the capital of the Republic of Moldova. He spoke Russian as well as Romanian. He had no history of anti-Semitism in his past, and he's selected as mayor of Odessa precisely because of that administrative experience and dealing with one of the eastern territories and governing in a Russian-speaking environment. And he brings a whole series of his colleagues from those earlier days in Romanian Bessarabia, brings all of this to bear on his experience as mayor of Odessa. That's the thing, though, that actually makes him suspect in the eyes of his superiors in Bucharest. He's doing everything in Russian, which the folks in Bucharest really can't understand. He seems to be pandering to the locals by having local administration use the Russian language. He seems to be overly concerned with getting the opera house, the famous opera house in Odessa, up and running again, which he does by the opera season of 1942. Why is he concerned with turning the electricity and the water on as soon as possible? And even after the war, Puntea was remembered by Odessans as being actually a rather good mayor. He's tried by the Romanians as a war criminal, imprisoned for a while, released, arrested again, tried again, released, and spends the rest of his life in some ways hiding out from the Romanian communist authorities, sometimes under an assumed name, but spends most of the post-war years out of prison, actually, and dies finally in 1968. Puntea, in so many ways, to me, is much more representative of the average Odessan experience. Puntea, throughout the post-war period, carried two talismans with him wherever he went, two letters that he had written, one to Ion Antonescu, another to Gheorghe Alexianu in the fall of 1941, opposing the roundup and deportation of Jews in the city. He said this idea that Jews are somehow involved in a conspiracy against the Romanian occupation, that they're closet Bolsheviks, all of this is fantasy. You've been given wrong information, he says to Antonescu, and he carried these things around with him to demonstrate his good faith. On the other hand, he never resigned as mayor. When he couldn't stomach attending the meetings of a committee that was called the Committee on Selection and Evacuation that the Romanians set up, that is the committee that identifies and then deports Jews in the city, when he couldn't stomach going to the meetings, he sent his deputy. He didn't call for the meetings to end. Incidentally, the same deputy who spent the rest of his time refurbishing the opera house. And in so many ways, that mixed experience of a character like Puntea, I think, is representative of what's happening in the city during the war. One of the things that I wanted to contribute in this book, in terms of sort of new empirical information, if you like, on the city, is a whole trove of documents that I discovered in the Odessa archives that I think really no one has seen since 1944. I came across them completely by accident. They are almost 100 files stuffed with letters that Odessans wrote to the Romanian occupation authorities, letters that are primarily letters of denunciation against neighbors, sort of saying that one's neighbor is a Jew, even though the identity documents say that the person is a Ukrainian, or coming up with grand theories about what's happening in the city and hoping that the Romanian authorities will look kindly on that information. Let me just read you very briefly what some of these are like. So bear with me. This is just one paragraph. Others denounced people who were not harboring Jews, but rather harboring their old clothes, safeguarding the personal effects of those who had been sent away. Still others reported that a neighbor had benefited unduly from items left behind when Jews were rounded up by the Romanians, that is, complaining that the person was not sharing the spoils with other residents in the apartment building. Amateur analysts gave their own interpretation of goings-on around them, working as informal detectives rather than as simple informants. The mysterious paper found in one apartment might be the residue of an underground printing press, surmised one local woman. The portraits of Hitler, Antonescu, and Romania's King Mihai that had begun to appear in local bazaars were very poorly done and needed to be policed, said another. One neighbor reported that an acquaintance was usually hanging out with bad elements and probably up to no good. Quote, at the same time, his apartment is the meeting place of hidden terrorist communists. And besides that, his wife is a Yid and is entirely surrounded by Yids. Židy in Russian. So this is, you find hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of things written on the backs of old posters, on onion skin writing paper, whatever piece of paper people had to hand, including candy wrappers, grease pen on the back of large candy wrappers. And it's a remarkable archival trove that no one has looked at before, and I think gives a kind of fine-grained portrait of the city during the war. So in other words, this is not so much the story in the 1940s of how a city was destroyed by occupiers, even though that's the memory that would become official with Odessa's hero status after 1945. It's really a much more difficult, subtle, and tough to digest story about how a cosmopolitan place learned to devour itself. And that in some ways is I think the upshot of this book, if you like. As I said, it ends in Brighton Beach. The Pushkin once said that in Odessa you can smell Europe, and if you go to Brighton Beach you can smell Odessa, or at least Odessa circa 1984. It's sort of that mix of old cooking oil and sour milk and axle grease and parsley and dill and perfume and sweat and a few other things, tobacco, all kind of braided together. And what I think you find in a place like that, and the way in which places try to reproduce themselves after incredible trauma, especially multicultural places that try this, I think is a very important lesson about how fragile social order can actually be. The upshot of this book is, in a sentence, that cosmopolitanism isn't so much a virtue as it is a project. And if you don't keep to the project, if you like, if you don't work at it enough, really awful things can happen. Being neighborly, especially in environments in which people speak different languages and cook food that you think smells funny and are too loud when they're talking in the hallway, neighborliness takes work. And I think in the Odessa case, you see an example of what a city can do when it gets neighborliness right, but also what can happen when it fails. I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Charles, and open the floor for questions. Jim, we'll have the microphone. 1 second.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Very interesting talk. Jim Meyer, visiting scholar, Woodrow Wilson Center. Also, former SSRC Eurasia Fund grantee. Thank you very much.
Here.
What cities come most readily to mind that you would compare Odessa to, and why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think any number of Central European cities that have large Jewish populations, that's sort of the first point of comparison I think one would want to make. The great difference, though, about Odessa compared to a place like Warsaw or Vilnius is that it self-consciously is a place that doesn't have a past, that doesn't have a history. It's founded in 1794. It's younger than Washington, D.C. It's this new city plopped into the middle of an old empire. And in fact, that's what traditional or conservative Jews would often say about Odessa, is that, there's no great Jewish scholar who comes from Odessa. There are plenty of Jewish writers who come from Odessa, Yiddish writers, Hebrew writers, and so on, who come through Odessa. Sholem Aleichem, is not from Odessa, but he spends time there. But you don't have, a Vilna sage, for example, who is, there's no great sort of history of Talmudic interpretation that come out of the city. Even the idea that somehow klezmer was invented in Odessa, I think, is not quite right, or much less jazz, much less Soviet jazz. A comparison that I make in the book is actually Naples. The real founder of the city, not because of the Jewish connection, but for totally different reasons, the founder of the city is a guy named Jose de Ribas, or the closest thing that Odessa has to a founding father is Jose de Ribas, who was Neapolitan himself and was the main person who suggested to Catherine the Great the idea that she might be able to create her version of St. Petersburg, a southern St. Petersburg that would be a kind of answer to the project of her predecessor, Peter the Great. A city that would, like St. Petersburg, look out on a different world, but not look out on Europe, but look out on the Ottoman Empire and on the Muslim world to show the fruits of civilization, enlightenment, and so on. That would have streets that meet at right angles. Odessa has a big wide open bay. Naples has a big wide open bay, and like Naples too, it revels in the seamier side of its character. It revels. It kind of has a, as they say in French, nostalgie de la boue. It has that kind of, it loves the grimy, in other words. It also has raised crime to a high art, like Naples has as well. So I do make that kind of comparison in the book. And Odessa always tried to set itself apart from other large Jewish cities in the empire, precisely because it was this place that was, open and expansive, not a place that sort of reveled in its past. If I could, I've given too long an answer to this, but if I could make one other point, that basic fact of Odessa's history to me, that it revels in the fact that it has no history, is also, I think, for many Odessans, the great shame of the city. That if you look around, the Black Sea, whether it's Istanbul or Sevastopol or Batumi or Trabzon or some of the other major cities, even Constanza in Romania, Varna in Bulgaria, these are cities that all had Greek foundations. That were originally emporia or trading posts from the 5th century BC forward in some cases. Odessa has none of that. It was a place that didn't have much of a Greek settlement. There's no unambiguous reference to a place called Odessa, or that would later become Odessa in ancient Greek sources. And today, if you go to the city, there is an archaeological dig right at the top of the Odessa steps that's covered with glass, and you can sort of peer down in the glass and look at what purport to be foundations of an ancient city. And there's an urn there, and the jawbone of a cow, and a few other things. Totally fake. In that it's, what a dig might look like if there were a Greek heritage to the city. And there's an inscription in English and in Ukrainian, not in Russian, in English and Ukrainian there. And in some ways, this to me is, I write about this in the book, is sort of emblematic of the shame that the city feels because it's not more grounded than it really is. But it's in fact that airiness, the ungroundedness of the city that allowed it, I think, to thrive for so long.
Right here? We'll go here first, and then.
Did you have a question? Okay. Hi, thanks. The comparison that came to mind for me was Salonika in Greece, and I was the story that Mark Mazauer tells in his book, kind of has a similar, in 1940s, the occupation kind of does similar things to the population there, with the mutual denunciation and so on. And it was also a city that had a long history of cosmopolitanism. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the role of nationalism as kind of creating a sort of pressure cooker in Odessa, over the course of the Soviet Union, leading up the 20 years or so leading up to the occupation, and if that sort of changed the way that people thought about what it was like to live in a cosmopolitan society.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're absolutely right. And Mark Mazauer's, Salonika is Salonika City of Ghosts, I think it's called, which is in some ways a kind of inspiration for this book. Now, the history of Salonika Thessaloniki is much, much longer, obviously. This is an ancient city that transforms itself rather rapidly over the course of the 20th century, from being, a largely Slavic and Jewish city to becoming, over the course of the 20th century, a almost totally Greek city. So how does that happen over time? It's also a city that's occupied during the war by Germany, and has, which also, as you suggest, has profound effects on the city's demographics. On the issue of nationalism, though, to me, Odessa's story in the 20th century is really not about nationalism so much. There was a kind of, what I call in the book, a segmented, multiculturalism. That is to say, Odessans like to look back on their history and think of it as a cosmopolitan place, but I have a pretty high bar for what, to me, cosmopolitanism is. And cosmopolitanism just isn't lots of different kind of food, in a place, or people from lots of different kinds of ethnic or religious or whatever backgrounds. Cosmopolitanism seems to me to be a real blurring, a forgetting of those lines. But of course, we know that by the beginning of the 20th century, even though this was still a very multicultural place, cultural groups tended to stay within their particular boundary. You always knew who was a member of which cultural or religious group. Those lines actually didn't blur very much, except in the case of Jews, actually, because this was a city where Jews could be assimilated to Russian culture. One of the characters that I spent a great deal of time on in the book is Vladimir Jabotinsky, a native Odessan, later to become the founder of what we now call revisionist Zionism. And so, in so many ways, the great enemy of Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, the founder of right-wing Zionism, and today, the inspiration for Likud and Shas and other parties in Israel. And Jabotinsky, in addition to writing what I think of as the great Odessa novel, actually his novel called The Five, which I would highly recommend to you, Jabotinsky said that he learned to be a Zionist from the Gentiles, by which he meant he learned how to be a Jewish nationalist by looking around him at what in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century was happening in the city. That if the Poles had their nationalism and the Romanians had their nationalism, why couldn't the Jews have theirs? And that there was nothing special about the Jewish variety. That Jewish nationalism was just like any other, and it required a kind of, there was a survival of the fittest in world nationalisms. One wasn't destined by God or by its ancient pedigree to have anything beyond what it could fight for. And for Jabotinsky, that's actually the lesson of 1905. The reason that the pogrom of 1905 was so violent, so destructive of the city, was not just because of the intensity of anti-Jewish forms of nationalism, but in fact because it was the pogrom in which Jews fought back. It's in which Jewish self-defense forces that had been created between 1903 and 1905 actually came into their own, having the city descend into what amounted to a kind of mini civil war throughout the second half of 1905 and early 1906. But to me, nationalism as such, by the 1940s, is far less important than the experience of Stalinism. Because when you read the denunciation letters, the form that they take is exactly the form of a Stalinist denunciation, right? Even down to the first line of many of them, I would like to bring to your attention the following information, : right? And then the person will go through his or her bona fides, right? I've never been a member of the party. My brother fought with the whites during the Civil War. I was repressed by Stalin in 1931. So all of these things that would have signaled that one was an enemy of the state in 1940 signal that one is on the side of the new power in the city by 1941. So it's really like stepping through a looking glass. Everything that was a vice before is a virtue now. And I think it was that experience, that, figuring out how you denounce somebody that is far more important than any of these ideologies. The other upshot from the political scientists in the audience, the upshot to this is the dark side of neighborliness, the dark side of intimacy, actually. Because you can only denounce somebody you know really well. You can't actually denounce strangers. It doesn't make any sense. You don't have enough intimate information that you can give to an occupying authority or whatever. And in some ways, the book in that section is about the way in which deeply connected societies, deeply multicultural and connected societies can actually in some ways be easier to destroy precisely because people are so connected. And once you get this master narrative coming in from the outside, shifting who is an enemy and who is a friend around, those intimate connections can be put to pretty venal uses.
So I'm sure you've considered this question many times before, but I wanted to ask the sort of Jan Gross Jadwabny question.
Yep.
You're changing the narrative of how the war is perceived in Eastern Europe and the notions of victimizations. And do you expect a backlash? How have you prepared to deal with it? Will the book be published in Ukrainian or in Russian, and how do you think it will be received there?
Yeah, well, the book is coming out in Russian, so it's already contracted with a publisher in Moscow. I have a long track record of disappointing one after another East European country or ethnic group, and so I will put this sort of in line with others, I guess. Yeah, it tells. I think it does tell a much darker story about this city's history, and some people have suggested that I maybe concentrate too much on this dark side of the city's past, but in some ways I'm trying to use that as a reaction against what I think is the very standard narrative that really is, to me, relatively recent. That's really a largely post-1945 phenomenon. That is, that this city is sort of a place of good-natured Southerners, and there's a sense of joie de vivre, and everybody always got along, and it was always cosmopolitan, and so on. There is a long narrative in Odessa's history that goes back to the 19th century. Even, in fact, you can find people in the 1820s and 30s, saying, city's not what it used to be. Really not what it used to be. So that has a long track record to it. But to me, the post-war Soviet narrative is the one that I think one has to, in a way, really counter. It's not that the city was never cosmopolitan. It's not that the city was never multicultural. It's just that if we take that line of argument too far, it really does cover up, I think, different kinds of experiences. Plenty of Jews did come back to the city after the war from Central Asia or from other parts of the Soviet Union by 1948, 1949, when they were actually allowed to come back into the city. But what do you find in testimony of either Holocaust survivor testimony or Soviet emigre testimony after the war is they will say the first time they really felt a kind of everyday anti-Semitism was after 1945. Not before 1945. So, the wartime experience, the occupation experience, and then the experience of the massive return of people trying to get apartments back is the thing that actualizes these ethnic differences that perhaps had been relatively muted before.
I was really fascinated by the beginning of your talk, where you were talking about power and resilience of a place, and the reputation of places. So, and you started with the building. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Also from your being there and sort of noticing that there is something about memory residing in places or in spaces. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I do think that there is something to the idea that places, that particularly interesting, dynamic, vibrant places that have reputations, places that give rise to a way of being, not just a place to be from. And there are relatively few number of places like that in the world. There are a lot of cities that are like that, but relatively few, in fact. And Odessa is one of them. That there's an Odessan way of being. Or that Odessans often say, my nationalist is Odessan. That's my patria in a way. I do think they have a resilience to them, but by resilience I mean that they're not quite able to rebuild things just like they were before. I mean, you can't go from 33% Jewish population to 12% and declining, from the 1940s forward, and believe that you can just rebuild your place as it was before. So much of the book is about the way in which memory substitutes for history, or in which in which a kind of social memory or constructed memory substitutes for historical experience, especially in environments in which that experience is particularly traumatic. Today in Odessa there's a great deal of building going on, great deal of refurbishment of the old city center. I don't work for the Odessa, tourist board, but it's well worth visiting. But it's sort of reconstructed in a way that fits more, I think, with this nostalgic vision of the past than anything else, and perhaps we shouldn't expect anything besides that. But to give you an example, a couple of examples. The old Brody Synagogue is still the building that I showed you. It's still the local archives. You would never know that it was an old synagogue unless you were a historian and happened to know the building. The old Glavnaya synagogue, the main synagogue, has now become the choral synagogue in the city, has a kosher restaurant in the basement, and has been refurbished really magnificently. There is a Jewish population in the city that's visible and present. I'm told that relatively few of the people who are Jewish and living there now come from old sort of Odessa families. They've moved in from other areas. There's a very large Jewish community center. I mean, a hyper large Jewish community center for the size of the Jewish community that's there now. And there's often, not only in the sort of memory of the Jewish past, but the memory of other communities' pasts, a real war of monuments that now go in public space that goes on. The old monument to Catherine the Great, which had been supplanted in the Soviet period by a monument to the Potemkin mutineers. First there was a monument to Karl Marx, and then there was a monument to the Potemkin mutineers, and now they've replaced that with the old Catherine monument from the imperial period. She points with her left hand to the port, but she's also pointing with her left hand to the north. She's pointing toward Russia. And when that statue was unveiled several years ago, there were these massive protests against it. So up went other statues to more Ukrainian figures. It's hard to find great Ukrainian figures actually in Odessa's history, and I don't mean to insult Ukrainians by saying that, but if prototypical Ukraine is a tiny village in Halichina, you're really not going to have figures from that history making a great impact on Odessa. But there is, a monument to Anton Holevate, one of the Black Sea Cossack leaders from the imperial period. There's a monument to Ivan Franko, one of the great, Ukrainian intellectual figures. And now, if you go to the old city center with its quintessential street, Deribasovskaya, which is the great pedestrian street in Odessa, you will find the street sign in Ukrainian, which is, of course, in accord with Ukrainian national law that, public announcements and street signs should be in Ukrainian, so forth. But seeing a faux antique street sign, which is what it is, to make you think that it's from the 19th century, but to see it spelled in Ukrainian is, to me, illustrative of the way in which memory gets sort of twisted around a bit. I had suggested to Odessans, and nobody found this funny, that all the signs should be in Italian, which is what it was like until the 1840s or so, actually, street signs in Italian.
I want to follow up on one point that you mentioned. You talked about Odessa being the odd city out as being a heroic city. And I'm curious if you could just explain that a little more. Why did the Soviet Union decide to designate Odessa as a heroic city? Were there certain actions by the local population that deserved that sort of recognition? And were they concerned at all how that would interact with their relations with Romania, which after all was part of the Soviet...
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a couple of thoughts. One is that, I would say next to the other three cities, it certainly ought to be on anybody's list, right? As one of the major cities that not necessarily as heroic cities, but major cities occupied during the war, and it spent the entirety of the almost the entirety, at least, of the German-Soviet war under military occupation. And so, almost ignoring it would have been more of a statement than putting it on the list. It was certainly after the war. A whole set of stories about the heroic activities of partisans hiding out in the Odessa catacombs, for example, and consistently throughout the war fighting the Romanians. That became part of the wartime legacy. The monument to the unknown sailor, which is still one of the major sort of tourist attractions in Odessa, the alley of memory that you can walk down in Shevchenko Park. All of these things were part of the sort of post-war construction of what the wartime experience was like. And so I think it had something to do actually with the place of Odessa itself in not so much in resisting the Romanian occupation, but the role that Odessa played during the war itself in Soviet propaganda. This was a Western city, a bright, shining Soviet city that was under the fascist boot. One of the most important wartime films that I write about in the book, a film called Dva boitsa, the sort of two warriors, with Mark Bernès, was one of his most important early film role, is all about this good-natured, life-loving Odessan who is fighting, actually not in Odessa, but fighting on the Leningrad front, and that becomes the songs from that film, Shalandi, for example, which is probably the closest thing that Odessa has to a national anthem. That becomes really critical during the war. That film comes out in 1943. So in some ways, leaving it off the list would have, I think, been more of a signal than putting it on. But you're absolutely right that after the war, the fact that Romanians are in control of the city is never mentioned. Right? The standard phrase, and this is not unusual in early post-war Soviet historiography, you always talk about the German fascist occupiers. Right? You never mention the Hungarians. You never mention the Romanians. It's sort of like that old scene from Fawlty Towers. Don't mention the war. And in fact, that memory of the war still affects the way that we think about Odessa's history today, and it's also, getting back to the question of how the book would be received, it's also one of the reasons that I try to punch that theme through the book. If you go to the Holocaust Memorial in the city, which there is, it has an inscription that talks about the Nazi occupation of the city. There was no Nazi occupation of the city. Nazis were never in the city. Einsatzgruppe D did come through briefly in the fall of 1941. There were German liaison officers there, but after that, there was no Nazi occupation. I mean, it's actually totally false. And the monument itself is a sort of a short alleyway of trees that ends in a child's playground, which is a bit unfortunate. But in any case, a long alleyway of trees with, in the middle of it, a small statue, with a very moving small statue, actually, with a group of naked men and women surrounded by barbed wire, standing at the top of a small flight of steps, recalling the famous Odessa steps. It's a small sculpture by Zurab Tsereteli, which is probably the smallest stature Tsereteli has ever made in his entire career. It's only about 2 feet high. But each one of the trees represents a rescuer. And judging by the names, almost entirely Ukrainian. So this is actually a Holocaust memorial that recalls the Nazi occupation and celebrates the rescuers of Jews during the war. It's an odd way of thinking about the wartime experience. Not that it's the wrong way of thinking about the wartime experience, but it's a supremely odd one.
I'm very much taken by the idea that familiarity and cosmopolitanism actually enables the appropriation of things that come second nature after the 1930s, like denunciations. And I'm very much taken by that, especially given what has happened in other cosmopolitan cities in the region. I'm thinking specifically about Baku and the vitriol with which that city erupts and what happens with the attacks against Armenians. Again, a city that had trumpeted its cosmopolitan heritage, but also in which lots of different cultures had lived cheek to jowl for decades, if not centuries, suddenly all of a sudden erupting to a very violent end. One shouldn't compare atrocities, but certainly the violence that we saw in Baku perhaps even exceeding some of the denunciations that you document so well in the book. And I wondered if that comparison either goes too far with the point you're trying to bring out, or whether that sort of more contemporary comparison adds at all to your idea about this idea of familiarity and destructive power.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comparison is very well taken. In fact, there's an earlier comparison, which is 1905, of course, when Baku itself erupts in Muslim-Armenian violence in ways not dissimilar to Odessa at the time. I had a really good graduate student who did a paper on that kind of comparison. I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there are things that I think the two have in common. One is, communities living very closely to each other. Secondly is the key role of the state. I mean, you don't get large-scale sustained violence often without the state stepping in some way. The state as an enabler of violence, not the state sort of putting an end to violence. It's also the case that I think in both contexts, the violence is perhaps more sort of vitriolic or more sort of basic and cruel in a way, because there's the sense that precisely because groups have lived together and know each other so intimately, it's not just a community rising up against your community, but it's a form of betrayal in a way. And so the sense of betrayal, I think, breeds a kind of cruelty or a kind of violence that perhaps is even more profound. I think yet another way is the fact that you have in Odessa both sides kind of arming. There have been anti-Jewish violence in Odessa before. In fact, if you read memoirs from the late 19th century, this is an annual thing. I mean, every time around Easter, there's going to be some kind of violence. There was significant violence in 1871, 1881, but what happens by 1905 is that both sides, in a way, are now armed because of the rise of Jewish self-defense groups in response to the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. And I think that creates, in a way, two armed camps, whereas before there had been perhaps one semi-armed camp and an unarmed one, so that the violence sort of blew itself out relatively quickly, if you like.
Any other questions? I think I want to get back to the image at the beginning, and you touched upon it, and that's the Brodsky Synagogue. So, as you said, there's no sort of landmark that identifies it as a synagogue. Was there any battles over the building after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Has there been any attempt to kind of
no, not to my knowledge. I mean, the building is superintended now by a very heroic group of archivists who, like archivists across the former Soviet Union, have no resources, very little support from the state, and are there to kind of keep the mice and the worms away from documents that many of us think are incredibly precious. Virtually the entirety of what's left of all the synagogue archives in the city, marriage records, birth records, are there in the Odessa State Archive now. So if you're doing Jewish genealogical research, for example, you don't go to the relevant synagogue, which doesn't exist anymore. You go to the state archive to look these things up. But no, to my knowledge, well, certainly there's no marker to that effect. And there's been really no desire to transform this, in large part because, where would you put the archives? You would need a new archival building, and so far there hasn't been a lot of effort to transform this. The size of the Jewish community itself being relatively small now, there's not a lot of incentive to do that. And with a large, newly refurbished synagogue just around the corner, and a very large Jewish community center and a small Jewish museum in the city. The old Brodsky Synagogue has kind of fallen on hard times, but it's a remarkable place to go to do research, and not I mean in no small part because of the really heroic efforts of people who work there.
Well, if there are no more,
Thank you very much for your presentation. In one of the most famous novels on Odessa, The Golden Calf, some people, through the whole novel, some people discuss the idea of Porto Franco. What happened with that idea?
Yeah. Oh, the idea of a Porto Franco, a free port, in other words. Odessa was a free port, that is to say, a duty-free zone, a tax-free zone, throughout most of the first half of the 19th century. And that was the real thing that allowed it to totally take off. Under a succession of foreign and then Russian governors general of New Russia, as it was called at the time, or what we now call southern Ukraine and parts of southern Russia. It was that tax-free status that allowed it to become really the preeminent commercial port of the Russian Empire in the first half of the 19th century. It was the thing that gave the impetus to the grain trade, so that by the 1840s and 1850s, great fortunes were being made and lost depending on what the grain harvest was going to be like farther inland. All of that comes to a halt in the 1850s, however, for a couple of reasons. One, trade is interrupted by the Crimean War, just at the time that it's really taking off. Secondly, Russia's relations with Britain, which had been its main trading partner for grain, were not great after the Crimean War, for understandable reasons. Russia's relations with France were not great for the decade or so after the Crimean War, for understandable reasons. And the Ottomans, too, which controlled the grain trade via the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, that diplomatic relationship is also very difficult after the war. More importantly, though, Britain's relaxing its grain laws, the rise of grain coming from North America, from the Dakotas, from Nebraska, and elsewhere, all of this begins to sort of shrink Odessa's role in the global grain trade. And even though you go to the city now, and the really most magnificent buildings that are still there in the city are from the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Well, what you're seeing the sort of the back end of the city's golden age. Its real economic golden age was in the 1830s, 40s, and the first part of the 1850s. You're seeing kind of the architectural residua of the city, rather than the height of its economic success.
thanks very much. Well, we have time for we'll have one last question here. Last question.
Thank you for the great book and beautiful presentation. In Russia, Odessa is known mostly for its geniuses and its dreams, and this part of Odessa's history about death is not that much known, maybe completely unknown in Russia. And maybe that's why you concentrated on your presentation on this part of history. But what could you explain a little more about Odessa as a dream, as a city of dream?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right that the book is really, in some ways, I guess, not quite in equal parts about all of those subjects, but certainly over the course of the 19th century, I try to bring out, the unique local culture that it's initially Greek and Italian core, later it's Russian, Yiddish, and what we would come to call Ukrainian elements, sort of bring to the city. What being in a boom town was like, which Odessa was in the 1830s and 1840s, this place that took off out of absolutely nothing. And that depended fundamentally on links with the wider world because it was a trade-dependent city. Odessa was a place that never really manufactured much of anything at all. It was a place that depended on trade. It was, the newest and most open city in the Pale of Settlement that allowed Jews in particular, to have a kind of openness to the wider world that they didn't have elsewhere in the Pale. But to me, so much of the way that we think about Odessa now really is a product of the post-1945 experience. That this idea of Odessa as a place that uniquely cultivated a kind of genius, musical genius, for example, is one of those things that gets added on to its history after this very traumatic experience in the war. Perhaps it's even a compensation for the traumatic experience in the war. The way that Soviet citizens come to learn about Odessa is really not because of music or Babel in the 20s and 30s. It's not even because of, Ilfin Petrov and their novels in the 20s and 30s. This is really a 1960s phenomenon. That's when these novels are republished and when people start reading them again. When Babel is someone that you can actually read now because he's been republished, not because his sort of books have been have been eliminated or banned or otherwise hidden. It's also the case that from the 1960s forward, with the rise of the Soviet tourist industry, people can now go to Odessa and really experience it. And so it's not so much that the City of Dreams or City of Genius is false, it's just that it really is a relatively recent phenomenon. What I'm trying to do, in other words, is put Odessa back into history. Not to sort of take it out of history and make it this dreamlike space, but to plunk it back down into its own historical experience and to try to understand it on its own terms.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank Charles very much for an excellent presentation. The book is available outside, and please join us for our reception. And thanks again to the SSRC for supporting this event as well. Yep. Thanks so much.